So it's really nice to be here and to start getting to know all of you. As I was mentioning to like Ted and Josh, that I finished my first year and I'm finally at that point now where I'm trying to get to know more people on campus and see what people are working on. And so it's a nice opportunity for me to be able to also introduce myself and my research agenda to all of you. I think the past few years, my research agenda, I've spent a lot of time mostly focused on the topic of gender, and more specifically, thinking about policies and interventions in low-income settings to reduce violence against women. I'm not going to talk about that today because my most recent paper, Michelle and Ted were at an event and I recently presented it. So I'm actually going to talk about it. It's a related topic. This is where we've also been doing some work recently on violence against children. And so today I want to present this new work. It's very new, so comments, questions, most welcome. Please feel free to interrupt me during the talk as well, and I'm happy to take questions. And I think I also want to mention that this is a collaboration between Leilis and Sean at the World Bank. Saravana, who used to be my postdoc at UCLA, is now an assistant professor at NUS. And then Helen is the psychologist on this project, and I will kind of tell you more about the work that she had historically been doing in Jamaica that we're going to build on in this project. But basically, I think one of the things that got me excited about this project and why I chose to participate is kind of another big thing I've been thinking about recently is this issue or idea of scale up, right? And so when we know that there are successful interventions happening in low income settings, how do we scale them up, right? Like, how do we get these programs to more people than just the small number of people that NGOs typically work with? And so that's going to be a piece of this. All right. So, I normally kind of start off with talking about how there's a global epidemic in terms of, if you look at like rates of violence against women across the globe, especially in low-income settings, very, very high prevalence. I also want to note, though, that there's a very, very high prevalence of violent discipline that caregivers, generally parents, regularly subject their children to. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I want to note, though, when we often think about violent discipline, we're often thinking about like kids who are 8 or 10 or teenagers. But the thing I want to note here is that this violent discipline starts really, really young, right? So I have this number from UNICEF here that approximately 3 in 4 children, ages 2 to 4, right? So really, the violence starts really young, and that they are regularly subjected to violent discipline by caregivers. And this violence that these kids face at home, and I should also mention, I'm going to be talking about violence in home. We also know there's a lot of violence in schools and the community and other places, but this project is really going to be focused on kind of parenting and violence that kids face in the home. There's studies both from low income as well as high income settings that show that this violence has both short-term implications, right? That kids do worse in school. There's kind of, self-worth, development issues. This later translates into negative impacts as these kids become teenagers. There are, often high rates of absenteeism, social problems in school, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also some evidence that this violence faced early in life, also has these negative impacts as these kids become adults in terms of labor market outcomes, involvement in crime, et cetera. Now, to date, there's very, very little known about what causally works to decrease violent parenting in lower and middle income country settings. Okay, there's just very little evidence on this. And there was a recent, global systematic review basically saying we need more evidence on this topic, because we just don't know, how we can kind of reduce the violence that we're observing in households. Okay, and so the research question that we're going to answer here is, can a digitally delivered, scalable information intervention on positive parenting practices. And I'm going to tell you more about what this intervention is, but basically think positive parenting practices. Can this intervention that will be digitally delivered actually improve caregiver attitudes and behaviors related to violence against children? Okay. And so what we're going to do here is as I mentioned, sorry, and I should have said one thing, we're going to be working in Jamaica. And the reason we're going to work in Jamaica is Jamaica has some of the highest rates of violence against kids in the household, kind of across the globe. And our partner, Helen, has actually already been working in Jamaica for many years with the ECC, which is the Early Childhood Commission, but doing really like small scale, let's get together and meet in person at the ECC, you know, doing kind of the type of work psychologists do, right? They kind of work with small numbers of people. She's been measuring impacts, getting positive impacts on the programming. So we said to her, hey, is there a way that we can take this, it's called the IRE Homes Toolkit. Is there a way to take this, you know, IRE Homes Toolkit and adapt it from this in-person small scale intervention to kind of, you know, make it this digital intervention. And so that was the first piece of it, was working with her to do all of that. And then once we had the, you know, the IRE Homes Toolkit digitally done, we're, you know, basically what I'm going to show you today is the results of an RCT. So we, you know, did an evaluation, a randomized controlled trial, where we look at kind of the, you know, the impacts of this digitally delivered scalable information intervention, which is basically teaching parents positive parenting practices. Okay. And so the key features of this will be, it's a 10-week program. So in person, it was 8 weeks. It becomes 10 weeks when we move it digital. And every week, each parent is getting 3 SMS messages. So they're being texted messages. In addition to that text message that they're then getting a link if they want to follow the link to, you know, an app, which will have more information on the topic that week. And then that's kind of the main piece of it. And then the other thing that the ECC was doing is once a week, the Early Childhood Commission had 1 hour where they would be like, hey, we're going to be hanging out here at this Google Meet group. If you want to log on and ask any questions or chat with us or whatever, we're here for you. Okay, so that's it. That's the intervention. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm just thinking about my own priors because I don't know your results.
Yeah.
In the communities, societies that I've worked in where there is a lot of physical discipline against children, people tend to have a very positive view of that discipline. They think of it as like really helping the kid, not spoiling the kid, and just being essential. And so I guess the very cynical prior would be like, how does like texting someone a few times change that like very deeply ingrained notion that this is like a very good thing? It is, you know, a lot of our other interventions in development are like, oh, I face this constraint. Now you've given me information which helps me overcome, like I don't have enough market information. You text me and now I can do something, but this is like a strongly held view. So I'm just curious, like when you went into this, how did you think about that?
Right, and you're right, and I think it is a strongly held view. And one thing I want to talk about, and I'll, you know, give you more details when we get to the intervention, but like never are we going to say like hitting your kid is bad or you shouldn't slap your kid, or, you know, so and that's the piece of this which I think the positive parenting piece of it is like, oh, sometimes kids can have tantrums, and when your kid is having a tantrum, here are some coping strategies that, you know, you may think about, or hey, this is how you might redirect your child from. So it's going to be, what's interesting about the intervention, and I'll show you in a minute, we're not actually going to talk much about violence, right? It's going to be much more, it's going to be positive parenting focused in that these are things that you can do. These are tools to equip
those
you.
can then help them avoid violence or something.
Exactly.
And you're going to define what you mean by violence at some point?
Yes, I am. I mean, so yes, I will. I mean, but basically we're going to use, everything we do will be the UNICEF definitions. I don't know if you're familiar with the mixed work that, anyways, but I'll let you know. So we're going to look at both attitudes as well as behaviors around violence as kind of the main outcomes. And then I think, you know, the reason I was excited about this was to see like, hey, is this even going to be effective? I have to say, I went into it also like Ted, a bit like, really, you know, is this actually going to change people's behaviors?
Can I ask one
Yes,
question about the
yes.
experiment?
Yes,
So you could experiment with the content of the app,
yes.
or you could experiment with app versus no app. What are you comparing here and
So-
why?
Thank you for asking that. So let me say two things about that. One is this is going to be a bundled treatment. So I'm not going to be able to tell you anything causal about like, hey, was it the SMS or the virtual sessions that mattered more? We do at the end, we come back a year later and do some focus groups and we talk to people and we think it's mostly, and I'll tell you a little about why we think what worked the best was just these SMS messages were probably the most effective thing. The control group will also get 3 SMS messages per week, but this was happening in 2021. So they will mostly be messages either around like COVID or keeping things clean, or it's all like public health messaging. But it's not really like what a psychologist would call positive parenting techniques. And so that will be the kind of what the control group is. All right, any other questions? And so just to give, you know, I know we don't have a ton of time, so I thought it would just be easier for me to give you the results and then we can kind of go through them. And so, you know, the first thing we do is, so as I mentioned, we have this RCT, we're going to have baseline data. This is a 10-week intervention. We will go in a month after the intervention ends and get end-line, you know, what we call our end-line data. And then we'll actually come back almost a year later, so like 10 months later. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to call short-term and medium-term results. And the short-term will be when we come back just 1 month later, and then the medium-term will be more like a year later, okay? But we are going to find for our treatment caregivers, they have learned stuff because, you know, the first thing we do is kind of quiz them on the curriculum. So we will find that there's been a pretty sizable, you know, impact on caregiver knowledge. And again, I'll show you these things in a minute. And then the next thing we're going to go through is like, hey, do we see any impacts on their attitudes? And one thing I do want to say here is all of this is self-reported, but you know, it's all self-reported behavior. And so, you know, we do collect information on social desirability, and we create the social desirability index, and we do many things to kind of convince you that these parents are in fact telling us the truth. But I will caveat that these are all self-reported behaviors from parents. So when, you know, we come back, we will find that there's been an improvement in their attitudes, both toward physical as well as psychological violence. And then we look at actual behaviors, and again, we'll find these reductions in reported physical and psychological violence. And so there, the question will be, in the last 7 days, how many times did you hit, slap, you know, hit your kid with either your hand or a something, you know, like something hard. And you know, so again, we're going to see reductions in both physical as well as the psychological violence. We'll also then ask them about kids, right? Because you would think that if parents are changing their behaviors, maybe the children are also, you know, experiencing fewer emotional problems. We do find a reduction in parents' reports of their kids' emotional problems when we come back a month later. These results will go away. So let me now show you, when we come back like close to a year later, these emotional problems on the kids are not persistent. But what is interesting is we do still find, you know, about a 0.4 standard deviation impact on our knowledge index. You know, and persistent effects on their attitudes around violence, as well as their actual behavior around violence. What's also interesting is we didn't find any positive impacts on caregiver mental health when we came back a month later, but when we come back almost a year later, what's interesting here is we are finding So for those of you who are interested, this is that we use the PHQ-2, which is just a 2-question measure of depression. We find improvements here. We use the GADS for anxiety, and we find an improvement in parental anxiety, as well as just their self-reported stress decreasing. And so, yes.
Right, and this is what it is.
Yes.
How did you find the parents? Are you enrolled?
I will tell you.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to tell you. This was also, I've never done this before, so it was fun. We worked with Digicel, which is Jamaica's cell phone, and they texted 2.6 million people in the country. It was pretty neat. But yeah, I'll tell you about recruitment in a minute. All right. And then just, I think in terms of contributions, there's a couple things I want to flag. One is at least a lot of the work that's being done on these topics in economics is it's all in person. It's very costly. It's very intensive. You can't get to that many people. So I think to me, what was exciting about this is that this is, as far as I know, one of the first virtually delivered interventions, right, to caregivers with the primary goal of reducing violence against children. So this program wasn't about nutrition or early child, it was very focused on violence. What else do I want to say? I think, I think that's about it. You guys, let's
Can I ask a question related to what you
Yes.
said? I'm shocked that anybody reads these messages on their phone, but apparently they are. And presumably you could analyze of the people who looked at the app, how big was the effect. But in terms of scalability, if we have multiple, there's going to be 10 more pieces of research done after people see this paper, they're going to do this.
Yes.
Isn't it kind of the case that the first app works, but the 7th app doesn't work because people just are if we would have sent things to email 20 years ago, well, it works great. Something it doesn't work at all.
So I don't know. I mean, one of the things that came up in the focus groups of why people actually like the SMS messages, say relative to the app, for example, was that they could do it on their own time, right? So, it's like my version of the kids are in bed, I'm going to turn on Netflix, right? It's I now have a minute, I can engage with this content. Because one of the things I'm going to show you later is that very few parents sign on to that Google group meet with the ECC. Very few of them kind of click through and watched all the app stuff. But what they did tell us was that they did read the text messages. I will show you some of them. But I think, it's a fair point. More of this needs to be done actually to see if these impacts last. I will also tell you, none of you guys asked me this question, but one of the things we've been looking at, right, is this, right, in relation to kind of what Helen has been doing in person and on a much smaller scale. And her reductions in violence are around 0.3 standard deviation, right? So she's getting double the effect size that we are. But the argument that I'm going to make later is that we can reach a lot more people and it's potentially a lot cheaper to do this. And this is still a significant reduction in violence, right? Question?
Do you know if there was also a reduction in violence in the control group? I'm thinking maybe there was also just a broader trend of reduction of violence overall.
So this is all, it's all on top, it's relative to the control group. I haven't let me think, have we just looked at the control group to see? We could look at that. I don't remember if we have, but all of these effect sizes are kind of relative to. Yes.
The data that you get on the results,
yes.
Those come from a survey you deliver via SMS.
So no, all of the surveys will be phone calls.
Okay.
We're calling them at home.
What is the approximate baseline prevalence of child violence? You said it's one of the highest. Could you again
let me show you some summary statistics. I'm going to show you some summary statistics on our samples. All right, so as I mentioned, this IRE Homes Toolbox has already existed and has been used in person. and it kind of, there's like 4 key concepts, right? So the first concept is to build these positive parent-child relationships, and a lot of that is through praise. And so, you know, you may get a text message like, hey, praise your child today for something that they've done well. Prevent misbehavior, right? And so a lot of this is around like, how do you model appropriate behavior for your kids? Setting limits, you know, this is kind of management of misbehavior. And then there's this emotional self-regulation component of it. And so these are the 10 topics. Each week you get one of these topics. And so, you know, you can, and IRE time is basically time that you're hanging out with your kid, doing something that they want to do, where the choices are reading, playing with their toys, and I think there's one other thing, right? But a lot of this is just about like, hey, hang out with your kid, have fun, but also like, how do you manage them when they're spiraling, you know, they're kind of spiraling, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to show you like what we did for the week 4. Week 4 was giving your kid clear instructions. Okay. And so these are the 3 SMS messages they got that week. So the first one is try to give your child clear instructions and praise them whenever they follow your instruction. Praise encourages positive behavior. And then they can link to the app if they want to. A few days later, they get SMS 2. As parents, we know our child best. We know when they are most likely to misbehave. This can help us to prevent bad behavior. And then a few days later, they get the IRE challenge this week. And so every week there's an IRE challenge, okay? And this week is give your child clear instructions and praise them when they do what you say. Have IRE time every day. Awesome job. All right, so you can see it's a very, very positive program, and kind of pretty prescriptive, right? In terms of like what you should do this week for giving clear instructions. So those are the SMS messages. And then, you know, for the app that week, what you would see is there would be a video where it would be kind of, you know, a parent giving clear instructions if you actually watch the video. There could be other links to looking at books video. This is the IRE challenge, right? Give your child clear instructions, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's the app piece of week 4. And then of course, remember, there's also the Google video call meet if you want to do that. Okay, so that's it. That's the intervention. And so they go through like 10 weeks of these various topics. Any questions before I go into recruitment? All right, so what we did for recruitment was, you know, because we were working with the World Bank, they were able to partner with Jamaica's largest cell phone provider, which is Digicel. And what they did for us really was they basically sent out, I think it's 2.6 million text messages all over the country. So all 14 parishes got, people got the text message. And I'm going to show you that most of our sample ends up being there. I don't know how many of you are interested in this. So we end up with about 1,200 people in our sample from 2.6 million text messages. But according to Digicel, so we had a 12% click rate, which means 12% of those 2.6 million people actually like clicked on the link. And that is much higher than their usual, which is around 5%. But again, this was our recruitment. And then ECC also wanted to be able to recruit people. But let me just quickly show you that the majority of people we will enroll in this came through the SMS, and then about 6% of our participants come through like people that the ECC folks knew.
And I'm sorry.
Yes.
The SMS made clear that it was about parenting.
Yeah. So let me.
And how do you know you didn't get like a selective sample of people who wanted to improve their parenting behavior?
Yeah. So this is the text they got. The University of West Indies invites you to participate in a study on positive parenting skills in Jamaica. So if, you know, what we are gonna do in this paper is I will show you summary statistics of like what these people look like relative to kind of the general adult population in Jamaica. But I am in no means going to make any argument that this random sample of, you know, like, I'm sure that, well, first of all, part of the selection, I'll tell you the selection criteria, you actually have to have a child ages 2 to 6 to participate in the study. But yes, this was the text that they got. And then if they actually, this was the click-through rate that I mentioned of the 12%. And then if they click through, let's see if I have, then they go through, you know, there's all the kind of the eligibility checklist of, show you what they are. So you have to be a caregiver of a child ages 2 to 6. You also have to have access to a smartphone or a tablet, right? Because that's part of the intervention. I will say though, I was worried about this because I do a lot of work in India also, where a lot of women don't have access to smartphones. In 2021, like 71% of people had access to smartphones, and that number has gotten even higher today. And so this was less of a constraint because we were working in Jamaica. And then obviously, you know, you have to be interested in participating and agree to kind of then do our baseline surveys, et
We have
cetera.
about 10 more minutes, so
Yeah,
I'm gonna let you regulate whether you're
Okay,
asking questions
thank
or
you.
talking.
Okay. All right. So we have a sample of about 1,200 people. What else do you need to know? Baseline survey, August 2021. We then do our, 10, 11 week intervention. I mentioned we have the short-term survey, our medium-term survey. And then a few months after that, we also did some focus groups with, some of the people to kind of understand some of our questions about the intervention, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned, we were caregivers in the control group. We're also receiving 3 SMSs per week. All right, so let me just quickly now show you some of our main results. So for the caregiver outcomes, UNICEF has already been doing a really good job of collecting data, both on kind of violence attitudes as well as violent behaviors. And so we're really just going to take what they've been doing and ask the same questions for, attitudes around violence against children, et cetera, et cetera. As I mentioned, we're going to do parental stress, PHQ-2, GADS. For the child behavior, so this was the fun thing about working with a psychologist. So I feel like when economists try and, collect these things, they don't do as good of a job. But everything we've collected here, these are instruments that already exist in psychology, and happy to chat about them at another point when I have more time. And then we're going to look at kind of what was going on, right? We obviously the information, but do you see improvements in parental self-efficacy, right? So after they learn all these things, do they feel more confident about their parenting and being better parents? Maybe this is a social network story, right? We had thought, oh, maybe they're going to start interacting with each other on these like Google groups and start talking. None of that does not happen. I'll just preview. There's kind of nothing changing here in terms of the social networks piece of it. We do actually see some improvements in parental self-efficacy. All right, Michelle, you asked me what these kids and things look like. So here are some outcomes, right? So this is the number of days in the past 7 days where there's been some violent discipline, and the average for both the treatment and control, it's about 1.3. So 1.3 days out of 7 that you've been like either hitting or slapping your kid. At baseline, what percent agreed with, attitudes around kind of this question of Ted, right? Do you agree that it's okay to kind of hit your kid? Again, 20-ish%, a little less than 20% of parents are agreeing with that. What percent of kids have conduct problems at baseline? Around 42% of kids have, their parents are saying they have conduct problems. Emotional problems, 26% of parents are reporting their kids have emotional problems at baseline. This is our PHQ-2, the 2 questions. And this is also quite high, right? Around 19% of the caregivers are reporting, the kind of the I don't want to call it depression because PHQ-2 is not depression, but it's sort of an indicator for depression. And part of this, remember, is, so I had wanted to do much better. In the end, 86% of our sample is females. I wanted this to be more of a 50-50 and do something interesting with gender. We just couldn't get the guys to sign. We tried. And so in the end, you know, part of this may just be because women tend to have worse mental health than men. What else do I want to say about this sample? So as I mentioned, you know, we're going to try and understand this sample relative to the Jamaican population. I will say that they tended to be a bit more educated, like by around 2 years. Or no, sorry, 1 year, I think, but 1 or 2 years. This is also amazing to me, again, working in South Asia, right? But mostly women, 78% of them are working. So really high, kind of highly employed. So probably like slightly better than your average Jamaican, if we were thinking about, you know, who these people are. Okay, so I'm just gonna, you know, what I'm gonna show you now is we're just going to estimate really simple ANCOVA specification. We'll have the, you know, the outcome of interest. We're going to regress that on treatment, and then, you know, we'll control for the baseline value of whatever that outcome is. We can include controls. We don't have to. It doesn't matter. These results are incredibly robust. I will tell you that. Okay, so this was the first, you know, did they actually learn anything? I'm sorry if you can't see this, but basically these are panel A is the short term when we come back 1 month later, and panel B is the medium term when we come back 8 months, 9 months, a year later. And you'll see, so these are all like, you know, praising children helps. It's important for parents to play with their children. Clear instructions help. Understand why child misbehaves. Calm down before disciplining. So we do look at all of these things separately, and then at the end here, this is just, you know, because we're worried about multiple hypothesis testing and all of these outcomes are highly correlated. We create this information index, which is just all of these things in an index, and you'll see that there's about a 0.5 standard deviation increase in parents, you know, treatment parents learning this stuff. Okay. All right, now I'm just going to show you some figures because I think they're easier to see. So this is now our caregiver attitudes around violence against children. And what you'll see here, this is the circle will be the short term and the triangle will be the medium term. And so, you know, the attitudes are improving. When we first come back, around 0.2 standard deviation increase, and then when we come back about a year later, it's around a 0.14 standard deviation increase, you know, improvement in parental attitudes towards violence against their children. This is the actual behaviors relating to violence against their children. And here too, you know, I'm just going to quickly flag these. This is about a 0.12 standard deviation improvement in caregivers, you know, in caregivers' violence against their target child. And here we break it up by physical and psychological violence. And they're around the same, maybe like a slightly larger decrease in you know, the hitting and slapping.
Mm-hmm. So you said that on average, people will hit before the intervention, hit their kids 1.5 times a week. So that would translate into what?
Can I get back to you? I have all the tables here. The reason we've sort of standardized everything is just to kind of compare with the previous work, but I'll tell you. Yeah, I don't know the number off the top of my head. All right, what else? Okay, so this was so this was me telling you that when we first came back, a month later, there was not much going on, you know, with depression or anxiety. And then when we come back a little less than a year later, you'll see that there's improvements, right? So there's about a 0.12 standard deviation decrease in you know, depression, similar size for anxiety using the GADS. And then this was, we just asked them about their stress, and it seemed like they were reporting less stress. Child emotional problems. So this, I mentioned this to you in the beginning, that when we first came back in the short term, we were finding an improvement in kids' emotional problems. But you'll see that when we return kind of a year later, they're not statistically distinguishable from 0. All right, I have a few minutes. I want to now talk a little about take up. As I mentioned, this is, a package, but because we have Digicel data, we can actually look at engagement, right? And so we can see that Digicel can confirm that, 92% of our people did get their SMSs. And from our survey data, we can also, basically see that these people engage with the SMS data. In terms of the app, now remember, there were 10 apps that people could engage with. The average, the number of sessions that on average people engage with was just 1. So there was very low app engagement. And you can see that, they only engaged for about 6 minutes. In terms of the sessions with the ECC guys, again, they could engage with 10, and the average was about a 4.5. So we do a little better there, but still, not great. So a lot of what we're learning suggests that it was mostly the SMS delivery that was doing the work. And then I think that, the thing that we've been thinking about more recently is trying to think about like what our potential pathways to change have been. Obviously learning about these positive parenting practices has been important, but we also have spent some time thinking about, parental self-efficacy, strengthening caregiver networks, et cetera. And this is just, again, to show you what's going on there. And you'll see that really the only big thing that has moved is this parental self-efficacy measure, where it does seem like when we come back, close to a year later, parents are again reporting on this scale of parental self-efficacy that they're much more kind of confident about their parenting abilities. Not much going on with support, or whether it's financial or social. There's just not much happening there. All right, so with that, let me I have like 1 minute. I'm not going to go through all of this, but we do spend some time trying to rule out that this is all just being driven by parents telling us what they think we want us to hear. And again, I'm happy to share the paper with any of you who are interested in looking at that. The other thing
Could you just say a sentence about the general idea there?
Yeah, so what we do is I don't know if you're familiar with the social desirability index, but it's basically a slew of questions you ask people that you can then create this index from to see like, how kind of socially desirable answers do you give? And then what you can do is you can control for that social desirability index. You can also interact it with your treatment to see, right, if kind of there's differential impacts based on how kind of socially desirable because we all have differing amounts of that. All right. And basically we don't find that that's driving our results. We were also worried that, hey, maybe you're no longer hitting your 2 to 4-year-old, but now you're hitting your 11-year-old. We don't find any of that. There's also, none of you guys asked me about attrition, but when we come back after a month, we find 90%, but when we come back almost a year later, we're closer to 65%. So we do a lot of work on attrition.
Do you have differential attrition by control and
We
weight?
don't.
Yeah, because you tell people to get people, you tell them you're going to give them parental advice, and then the branch of the control people don't get parental advice, they get COVID-19.
Yeah.
So don't they complain about that?
No, because they're just getting 3 SMSs, right? I mean, you can ignore them. I feel like, anyways, so the last thing I just want to say is we're kind of trying to think through costing, and it's been a little more complicated. Why has it been a little more complicated? Because the you know, if we look at kind of the main outcome of physical violence against children, as I was saying, when you do it in person, you're getting about a 0.3 standard deviation reduction relative to our like 0.13. And so the cost of the virtual per person is significantly cheaper, but if you're kind of looking at it cost per effect size, they're not, you
Why
know.
does this cost anything? Sorry. Adding a person doesn't cost anything, right?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked it. The main costs were the getting everything digitized, which one could argue is a fixed cost, and we should throw those costs away. The other main costs were related to the staffing at the ECC for the the group meetings. But again, what we've been trying to push is that it doesn't seem like those things were actually super effective, and maybe you could phase them out. ECC is not happy about that. So anyways, all that to say, this is something we're still thinking about. If any of you, I feel like this is not my expertise thinking through costs. So
Can I just-
happy, yes.
The in-person costs, like, who is that population? Who is that based on?
It's the same population of parents. What do you mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, they were enrolled through SMS.
So we're comparing that. So Helen used to do this in person with ECC. So these are her costs. And then this is the virtual for what we did.
But the outcome, the treatment effect
Yep.
you found,
Yep.
based on randomly picking parents, or how did they?
Her stuff or
Yeah.
our stuff?
The in-person stuff?
Oh God, I mean, it's much smaller and it's probably also select because that's a good question. I should know how she selected. Okay, so let me just end there now and let's talk about it. This is just kind of an overall conclusion of findings. How to make an economist give a talking point.
Good job.
So I understand that you define physical violence as hitting the kids, but
Yeah.
you didn't define what you mean by psychological violence, like who's a timeout, meaning physical violence, psychological violence.
I can read you all of them. So I'm glad you're asking this because we had a lot of discussion with them about this whole like timeout business, right? Because is that so? No, it's a timeout is not considered, bad parenting in their books because it's the idea of like you need to give your child some space alone, apart. It's more the process of how you give them that timeout, right? By doing it in a very positive way, as opposed to like you have to go sit in that corner because you're a bad kid, right? But there are kind of they teach parents how to do positive parenting timeouts. And I will, you want to know about the attitudes towards violence? Okay, so these were the attitudes, and this is all from this UNICEF survey. So let me read you some of them. A good parent slaps their child when they misbehave. When a child is beaten, he or she will stop doing the unwanted behavior. Shouting and yelling makes the child more obedient. Shouting, yelling, and threatening to slap will harm the child. In order to bring up, raise, or educate a child properly, the child needs to be physically punished. So these are all like attitudes towards violence that we have.
So psychological shouting and yelling?
Yeah, the psychological is much more about like threatening, shouting, yelling, but it's a lot of the kind of like threatening behavior is a lot of the focus.
I had a question about the causal interpretation of this. These are all people who were selected on their kind of treatability. They're interested in positive parenting because they signed up.
They signed up, yeah.
How does that compare to with the other talk we saw recently, deworming? There's nobody's choosing to be in the study or not.
Right.
This is obviously something.
Yeah.
How's that thought about in the causal analysis literature?
I mean, look, I will say that this is no different than any parenting study, right? Because everything we do, whether it's in person or digital, like the parent actually has to agree to participate and be interested. Now, whether or not they change behavior, is another question. But it's hard for me to think about a world where you would have a parenting intervention that would just be an absolute random sample of people who weren't interested.
I'm not criticizing the way you did it, but so how do we
Right.
interpret? So how do we interpret the?
I mean, I think like the only thing. So what we're doing, right, is looking at this population relative to the kind of average Jamaican population to try and think about how these people might be different. And then, if, say, for example, they're a year more educated than the general adult population, well, maybe that means they're responding to treatment a little better than, I don't know, the randomly selected parent in Jamaica. It's hard, right?
But isn't the concern is that these people are, I'm worried about how I'm parenting and I need help.
Yeah.
And so I'm willing to listen. That's your population versus everybody else who's
I don't know if I would frame it as I'm worried. I would frame it more as like, hey, I'm interested in learning more about how to be a better parent. Right? I think that may be, I don't know, unclear though, right? I think I don't have a good answer to your question. I mean, you're right that these people all did sign up. I will also say though that the people in the control group also signed up and, to get these messages.
Just a clarification, they didn't get paid anything, right, to participate?
The only, they didn't get paid to participate. They did get paid $2 Jamaican per survey. So all of them, we did compensate their survey when we were doing that. Yeah. Yeah.
I have some questions about the setting. So
Mhm.
the first question is about the general attitude towards children. So for instance, are children physically disciplined in schools or in other contexts, which could be counterproductive. And the second question is, there something specific about Jamaica, or do you think this is applicable to any country, to parents who are in the US there, or in France there are people keeping their kids? Do you think that would be applicable, or do you think there is something that's cultural, that's specific about Jamaica in particular, or low-income countries in general, in terms of violence against family members?
So I will say there are very high rates of violence against children across the globe in low-income settings. And so, no, Jamaica is not unique in that way. I will say though, in terms of Latin America, I think Jamaica ranks third in terms of, violence against children in that region. But there are, I think, Ted's question early on was a really good one. So here's my sense of differences. A lot of it is around norms. So I don't know what changed in the US, because my father and I always actually argue about this. He's, Indian, and I swear to God, he slapped me when I was little, but he claims he didn't. But the point is that, like, it used to be much more socially acceptable to hit your kids. And as a parent, we often joke that these days it's actually hard to get your kids to listen to you because there's no threat of like corporal violence, because that's just not, the social norms have changed so much, right? That in general, like, people are not hitting their kids. I don't think the social norms have changed as much in a lot of low-income settings where it is still very socially acceptable to slap your kid or to hit them with something. And so you have these types of interventions, but to me, like, an interesting question, which I still don't understand, is why did things change here? Because they basically changed in a generation, right? And like one generation of parents, it's now like, you do not hate your kids, right? And I don't know why that shifted, but it did. And I think that shift just hasn't happened in a lot of settings.
And my first question is about general violence towards children.
Yeah. Also high, like, it's in many of these places you can, teachers are hitting kids.
So, that might not make any difference to the kids, whether they're like half the time a week instead of one time.
Yeah,
every day at school.
No, but I don't think, look, I don't think teachers are, I think there's probably a lot more happening in the household. Like at school, it's probably, the few bad kids or whatever. But, as you saw here, I think for parents, it's a technique, right? When you're frustrated. And so part of this intervention is like, hey, when you're frustrated as a parent, there's other things you can do, right? You can go take a fresh breath of air, or, you can redirect and do, play with toys, or it's kind of how you change your reactions to your kids' misbehavior.
Okay, I think we have a question online, and then we'll
Okay.
thank you.
Okay.
Oh yeah, Jenna asks, what is your sense
Ah.
of how enduring these effects will be,
Yes.
given how much we know about the reach of violence and the outcomes?
Yes, so I think this is a great question. I don't know. I mean, I will tell you that it was really nice to go back almost a year later and find that the impacts had lasted, because I was worried. We've run out of money, but I would love to go back. It's fairly easy to go back because we're doing these things over the phone, and we know where these people are. And I think this is an important question, right? Because my sense of these types of interventions, also being a parent myself, is you often need to kind of hear these things every so often. And so, I think that's a great question for further research. Yeah.
Okay, great. On that note, thanks so much, Manisha.